and welcome everybody. This webinar is titled The First 90 Days in Your New Role Overseas. So it's great to have you with us here as we discuss this really critical topic. I am recording this webinar, so just to keep that in mind as we go through. The first 90 days in your new role overseas began out of a thought from a coaching process when I was working with people. Initially, I became familiar with some of Michael Watkins's work, which I referenced in the advertisement you may have seen. He has written a book. I'll just take you to his book, The First 90 Days, Proven Strategies for Getting Up to Speed Faster and Smarter. Now, he's not specifically speaking to the issues of global roles. He's speaking perhaps about moving into a leadership role in the situation in the country that you're familiar with. So for those of us who have moved globally, we're very aware that the global roles can add new challenges to those first 90 days. And that's what we're going to be addressing in this webinar. So just to introduce me, I'm Tricia Carter. That's my picture there. And I am an organizational psychologist. I've been working in global mobility and coaching and training and consulting in that area for 15, maybe 20 years now, and have coached numerous people who have moved in roles to different countries. So we'll be talking about some of their experiences as well in this time. Please make a point of using the question box if you have a question. I'll be stopping at a couple of points in the webinar and checking the question box to see what you've popped in there, and take some notes of things that you want to remind yourself about. So the first 90 days, we will be looking at Michael Watkins' work, and then we'll be looking at how that compares to a global role. So that's the way we're going to jump through things today. One of the most interesting aspects, I think, is that Michael Watkins suggests that there's a break-even point between the value an employee consumes and the value they create, and that break-even point in a new role, a new leadership role, comes at about 90 days. In my discussions with many of the expats around the world, we think that probably when you're adding in a different country and a different culture, that break-even point might come a little bit further on. So the challenges of the first 90 days may extend a little bit further for expats and migrants. So here's one of the comments from one of the expats that I've worked with. The plan that I put into place was initially focused on work-based deliverables, but what that didn't include was a plan to deal with cultural differences. So while work objectives were eventually met, they took significantly longer than I'd anticipated due to having to change my management style midway through. So there are many different aspects to consider when we consider the first 90 days in a global role. Watkins' points from his book go through set yourself up, accelerate your learning, match strategy to situation, secure some early wins, negotiate success, achieve alignment, build your team, create coalitions, and keep your balance. Now, I'm sure that as many of you imagine, this could be, a couple of days worth of a training program, and we're going to jam it all in. We hope to be finished under the hour. 45 minutes is my goal, but it would be good if we can make it short and sharp. So I'm cutting it down to some of the things that I think are really critical for expats. So the first 90 days, we're going to look at setting yourself up. We're going to look at accelerating your learning, matching strategy to situation, securing some early wins, negotiating success, building your team, and keeping your balance. So let's start with the very first one, set yourself up. Actually, Watkins didn't call it set yourself up. He called it promote yourself. And a little bit he was talking about the fact that sometimes when people take a new role, they don't actually break with their previous role. So they don't actually step into the new role and promote themselves to the new situation. But from a promote yourself perspective, Australians are not necessarily all that comfortable with promoting themselves. It goes a little bit against our core culture. And I actually feel that what he's actually talking about is setting yourself up to succeed well. So we've changed the title on this one. If you're looking at his book, and I would suggest that you do that, this is his first chapter called Promote Yourself. So creating a clear break point is one of the critical things that he points out that people need to do, that you can't continue being responsible for your old role or keeping an eye on your old role while you step into your new role. He says also that it's really critical to self-assess and look at what you're bringing to the new role, as we all know, the skills that got you to the previous role are not necessarily the skills that will enable you to succeed in the next role. It may be that you need a more strategic viewpoint, a broader set of financial skills, and perhaps your previous functional skill set didn't include those. So you may need to self-assess and have a look at what you need from a new strengths development perspective. And you might need to rework your network. Again, the network may have been focused on that functional role that you had, and now that you're stepping into a leadership role, you may need a broader network. So that's Watkins' points around setting yourself up in a way that you can succeed. So what about from a global perspective when you're taking off overseas? Well, we often work with people and include them in our online membership e-resources and refer to leaving well. And in the Leave Well section, we have a great deal of ebooks and webinars that speak to the issues about leaving, because you are leaving people behind, you're leaving a place behind, you're leaving your previous work, and you're leaving a culture behind. So you need to be able to leave in a sense that you can look ahead. So you need to leave well. You need to say your goodbyes. You need to finish things up. So the people that you leave behind, you need to be in a good relationship with, that you're not going to be worrying about them when you're away. And on the work side, that's a real plus in many ways when you're leaving to a global role, because there's less likelihood of somebody coming in and consulting with you on your previous role when you've actually moved countries. But often in all of these aspects in terms of leaving well, there's a great deal of personal organisation involved. So there's logistics that you have to organise. It may be that you need to get your financial affairs sorted so that they tick along without you managing them from quite such a close perspective. You may need to put some legal things in place as well. It's really good to have a cultural briefing, because often when I work with people, there's that sense that the cultural briefing is the moment in the middle of the madness of packing and organising that enables them to really focus on where they're going, what they're going to be doing, what they need to understand about that place, and perhaps what they want out of it. So leaving well can include all of the aspects of people, place, work, culture, and planning as well. We definitely need to self-assess. So just as Watkins said about the skills that we bring to the role, we need to self-assess around those skills as well. But we need to add in the aspects of cultural intelligence and understanding our own cultural value system. Cultural intelligence includes our motivation, our drive for the role that we're going to in the country and culture that we're going to be moving towards. It includes the knowledge that we might have about a culture. It includes the CQ strategy component, that ability to think differently, to see things differently when you need to. And also CQ action, the ability to do things differently, which you'll need to do in a different cultural environment. Self-assessing your cultural values can be a really powerful thing, because it helps you to know what are the core values that you have been raised with. They may be the same as the country around you, or they may be a little bit different. And it's really helpful to see how they might be similar or different to the people that you'll be working with. I often talk about growth mindset and how it helps us in terms of growing and developing. So for those of you who are regulars on the call, apologies for putting it in there yet again, but growth mindset helps us change our thinking, because it might be that you're tempted to go, oh, I'm not strong on strategic thinking, or I'm not strong on financial management, and I'll need to up those skills. Or it might be that I have no understanding of this culture. And it's really helpful to take that growth mindset perspective, to add in the word yet at the end of those sentences when you hear your brain telling you them. But just to recognize that these are things that you can learn, and the effort involved in learning is something that you're already doing and already good at. So taking with you an assessment of where you're at in terms of a growth mindset. And definitely you'll need to take a look at your network. Now, chances are your networks in the country that you're going to might be a bit slim, but there's lots that we can do about that if you're still in the pre-departure stage. You can start developing connections in the new country now. You can use LinkedIn and Facebook, recommendations from people that you know who have lived and worked there. There are meetups that you can be involved with in terms of associations such as chambers of commerce that might include the country that you're going to and your own country. So you can begin building those relationships even if you haven't yet moved. If you are already in the new country, then think about the networks that you're building. So you need to set yourself up in a way that will support you from both a cultural perspective as well as a role perspective. Watkins talks about accelerating your learning. He actually says that in the first 30 days, we should focus on learning, so that the first 30 days in a new role should be more about learning than about achieving things. And, to me, that sounds like a really good idea, that the first 30 days you're learning your new job, you're learning your new role, and you focus your time and energy in that learning component. You need to think, he says, about the past, the present, and the future of the organisation and the role that you've stepped into. So we tend to come into a new role thinking with a future orientation. What am I going to bring to this? How am I going to change things? What's going to happen? But often you can't plan for the future until you've understood the past and recognised the present. So the past, present, future is an important learning that you need to do. Watkins suggests that you build a learning plan, which is a really powerful thing to do. He talks about sources of insight. He said it's important to get to know the historians in the company around you and the integrators. So the people who can tell you about the history, how things got to be where they are, and also the people who will introduce you to other people. So building those sources of insight is an important component. And he says you need to learn about the culture of the organization and also recognizing that different departments or silos, if you like, within the organization might hold on to different cultural aspects. So recognizing and learning how the culture of the organization works. So what about from a global perspective? Well, accelerating your learning is really critical. You've really got to focus time and energy on learning. You're not just learning a job, you're learning the location, and that does take incredible amounts of time and energy. So much of what we do at home is built into the part of our brain, the limbic system, that operates automatically. So the way we get around, the routes we take, often those things are automatic and we don't even need to think about them. We certainly don't need to focus time and energy. But in our first perhaps month in a new location, we need to use all of our prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of our brain, just to get from work to home, just to get around the offices and the workplace. So we need to focus time and energy on learning the basics as well as the more complex things. So recognize that that learning is going to be a critical part of what you're going to be doing and allow yourself to do that. You need to be looking at the country, learning about the country, learning about the location, and learning about the organisation as well. So it's not just the past, present, and future of the organisation, but the past, present, and future of a country and a city. And it's important to understand that context, because if you don't grasp those implications, it'll be really hard to see why your role is the way it is and how it's operating within the organisation. You need to plan your learning to include systems and data and people. So systems within the country, such as legal systems, there'll be things that you need to learn about employment law, about occupational health and safety. There'll be many things that you just don't know. And often you don't even know what you need to know that is important. You'll need to know about data as well, about some of the facts and figures of the place, and about the people. The people will be critical to you building that understanding. So who are the local experts? Watkins was talking about sources of insight within the organisation. Well, what about for you? Sometimes there will be people within the organisation, and again, you'll need to know the historians and the integrators, the people who can introduce you around the place. But you might also need those local experts external to the organisation to explain the broader picture of the country and the culture as well. And you need to understand the culture of the organisation. So you need to really set yourself time to learn about, and we're talking really about, you're probably familiar with the iceberg of culture, the things that sit above the the iceberg, above the water level, the language that's spoken, or the languages that are spoken, the government and how it works, the religious beliefs, the education system. And then below the surface, what are the values and mindsets? What are the people's beliefs about gender, gender differences, about work and workplace and work ethics? So there's a great deal that you need to do. So accelerating your learning is a rather critical thing to do. So maybe just take a moment to reflect and think, what learning have I already done? And how much more do I need to do? So perhaps just in your notebook, write down those questions. Acknowledge that there's probably some things that you already know, possibly a great deal, and that there are some things that you can do to keep building that knowledge. So what you are thinking, what you are learning is important to you, so continue to do so. And an interesting quote here about it depends on the role you're coming into. If it's an established role, obviously, then you will experience far less stress. Someone else will likely have already created the processes by trial and error or by asking questions. But often when people move globally, sometimes they are the first in the role. It might be a new role that's being created. So then you have to go through the stress of trying to understand and navigate a new world and feeling like nothing is easy. Nothing. So perhaps that quote just helps you to realize that somebody else has stood in the place that you're standing and faced the challenges that you're facing as well. So back to Watkins' processes, we've talked about setting yourself up and accelerating your learning. We're now going to look at matching strategy to situation and securing some early wins. Watkins has a great chapter on this, matching strategy to situations, and he suggests that we should look at what stage is the business at. He talks about STARS, startups, turnarounds, realignments, sustaining success, or shutting down and downsizing. And it might be that the business at home, if you've been transferred internationally, might be at quite a different stage to the business internationally. Watkins has a whole series of strategies in his book on how you can think about adapting your strategy to the situation that the business is in. So we're not going to go into that now, but I do want you to think about something else in terms of matching strategy to situation. So what stage is the country at? What's the GDP of the country that you're going to, and how does it compare to where you've been working so far? What are the health statistics? What's the education levels? What about the infrastructure and the politics? So how will these things impact? Well, the GDP is likely to impact on people's expectations around wages. Perhaps as the GDP changes, there may be increased expectations on wage growth. It may be that your concept of appropriate wages is very different to the in-country concepts because of differences in GDP. Health might impact on such things as absenteeism within the organisation. If you're going somewhere where issues such as malaria are prevalent, then that might be an impact. It might be that people's health impacts on their family issues, which might then impact back at work as well. And to what extent do they have health insurances that support them in that process, or is that something that comes from the organisation? What's the education levels in the country? What's the literacy levels? What does the education focus on? What's the STEM education like? So have a look at those aspects and think about how that might impact on people coming to work. If there's a low literacy rate, the people that you're working with are probably the cream of society. They're probably sitting in a very different position, perhaps, to the people that you've been working with back home. What's the infrastructure like? What's the roads, the electricity, the water, the sewerage, and the critical digital infrastructure? What's the internet like? Often people coming to Australia are surprised at the infrastructure. So things like the way the trains work or the way the internet works can be a disappointment for people because they have an expectation based perhaps on the GDP levels that the infrastructure might be at a higher level. And what's the political situation like in the country? Are there things you're going to need to be careful of? Are there things you're going to need to not say? Or Are there things that are happening that perhaps will create some tensions in the environment that you might be working in? So politically, it's really good to be aware. As a start point, I would suggest Googling the World Factbook and having a read of some of this data that you can easily get a hold of. One of the good things the World Factbook does is enable you to compare the country that you've been in to the country that you're going to, so that you can see some of those comparison points. So, securing early wins. Given the learning that you are working on, given the situation that you're facing, what will the short-term solutions be? Because they're often the first thing that people think about in terms of early wins, and that's certainly what Watkins put up there. But he also suggested that instead of thinking about short-term solutions, you should also think about the legacy that you're going to leave. So right at the beginning, think not just about what can I do in the short term, but also what do I want in the long term, so that you can be setting yourself up for leaving the role in a good place. He suggests that you think about, or that you write the letter now for your next promotion, so that the letter that you write will say what you've achieved in this role and that you can look back on with pride. He suggests that you look at A-level priorities. Now, chances are for somebody in a global role, the A-level priorities might be things that are set by head office. And we'll come back to that in a little while. And he also talks about core problems. So what are the core problems that need fixing? So some of these aspects will enable you to secure early wins. So what do we think about that from a global perspective? Well, one of the problems that I alluded to a moment ago, that there may be in-country wins. So the things that the local people want, the local management want, may be very different to the expectations that you've been sent out with if you've come from a head office situation. So you need to be clear on what the head office wins would be, as well as what are the in-country wins, and recognize if there might be possible conflict between those. And there might be different ways to win, so that there might be different ways of achieving some of those things. One of the people I was working with was a manager of a business development team, and his role was to improve their efficiency and effectiveness. And when he went out there, one of the things he realized was that they always went to BD meetings as a team. And he felt that perhaps they lacked confidence. And one of the reasons he'd been chosen for the role was to use his coaching skills to develop the people. And so he definitely began to do that and began coaching people, skilled them in the BD skills, went out with them and took them out with him and observed, gave them feedback. And they certainly increased their skills in terms of business development conversations. But he noticed there was still a strong tendency for them all to go out together when he wasn't going out with them. So when he asked the question, after having built those relationships through mentoring and coaching, why are you all going together? He discovered that the reality was there were only a couple of them in the team who had a driver's license. And so the different way to win for him was to coach them in getting driver's licenses. And having done that, they were able to go out in pairs or by themselves, which, as head office had wanted, was increasing their efficiency and effectiveness. But it was a very different way to achieve that win. Definitely something that the in-country people greatly appreciated. So securing early wins might be something you need to think at quite differently from the way that the role was pitched to you when you went out. And sometimes there might be real conflicts. One of the respondents to my survey said, make sure you deliver what's expected, even if extra hours are required, but then also share the experience with other managers in head office to ensure they have realistic expectations of the work environment. Educate others on the additional challenges that you might be facing, whether it's IT issues, language differences, general work ethic. With some of the people that I've been working with, some of the new situations they've encountered have been so unexpected that head office could certainly not have anticipated them. So issues around logistics where it was just impossible to get the goods onto ships that needed to be delivered to outer islands, or issues around encountering dangerous weather. So one of the people I was coaching the day after he arrived, a cyclone hit the country, and that impacted on electricity and water for the next number of weeks. And he was the head of operations. So obviously that fell into his area. So understanding that head office may have expectations, but they need to have fed back to them the situation that you're working in. And you need to feed that into your expectations and reality as well. So negotiate success. Now that we've been talking about negotiating back with head office, Watkins is actually talking about with your new boss. So that is your critical relationship, the new boss that you are relating to. Now, if you have moved into a situation as a country head, your new boss is quite likely back in head office. But if you've moved in and you're reporting to an in-country manager, that development of that will be your critical relationship to develop. So Watkins says you need to invest time and you need to take responsibility for building that relationship. He suggests that there's 5 conversations you need to have: a situational diagnosis, a conversation around expectations from the boss themselves, a conversation around styles. So what's your boss's style? What are the resources that you have to work with? Oh, and obviously in terms of styles, talking about what your style is too. And your personal development. So those 5 conversations are really critical, and they are things that you need to have conversations with in your new role from a global perspective as well. So especially around expectations, because as I said, they may be very different to what you thought they were when you came out, and especially around styles, because styles of working may be very different because of the cultural values that we've grown up with. So when we think about success from a global perspective, we need to think about the conversational and cultural filters that might be sitting over those conversations we might have. And they might come in the form of status and formality differences. They might come in the form of communication styles, the direct, indirect. And so if you've moved somewhere and your boss is perhaps more formal, has a higher sense of status, it may be hard to get to that open conversation situation, especially if you are accustomed to perhaps a more egalitarian style and a more direct communication style. So you need to be careful in having that conversation with the boss so that you can enable them to feel comfortable with you and enable them to have the confidence that you're going to be operating effectively. So again, this is something that some cultural learning can really help you with. So, where are we up to? We've talked about securing early wins and negotiating success, and we're moving on to building your team and keeping your balance. 2 more critical factors as well. So when it comes to building your team, Watkins talks about assessing your existing team. So in many roles, you walk into a team that already exists. And it might be, as I was speaking to one person who'd been brought in to lead an organisation here in Sydney and discovered that the team were not happy with the appointment of an outsider. And so many of the team resigned in the first couple of weeks. I don't think that's a particularly Australian characteristic, although I have heard of that happening a great deal within the Australian culture, that if the team feels that the person who's been brought in has perhaps overshadowed somebody within the team who deserved from their perspective the role, then they will walk with their feet. So if you have an existing team and you want them to stay, then you need to treat them very carefully. Now, this person said that the team leaving was actually a positive aspect. So that can certainly happen because sometimes you may want to restructure. You may want to keep some people in place. You may want to keep some people and develop them. You may want to move them to another role. You may want to observe them for a while and then decide if you want to replace. So you need to consider all possible alternatives. It's not just keep or replace. And you need to treat people with respect, and with respect from the way that they will see it, because their cultural perspectives of how you treat people with respect may be different to yours. So in Australia, we tend to have a very task-oriented mentality. And in some places, relationships are far more powerful. And so it's important to know is this an organization that I'm walking into where the relationships are so powerful that if I let somebody go, it might impact significantly on other situations. So you need to make cultural observations and have cultural conversations. You need to talk with your team about your style, and perhaps you need to have an open conversation about things like formality. It may be that they will always call you by your title rather than your first name, or it may be that you're surprised that you're being called by your first name because you're used to a more formal environment. It may be that your communication style is less direct, perhaps more high context, and so being communicated in a very direct way may feel threatening to you. So observe the differences and how they are impacting on you. And it may be that there's an element of individual versus group. So you might feel like you need to speak to the team and that the team will respond, but they might prefer to be being spoken to as individuals and responding as individuals. So you may need to do some building relationships both with individuals within the team as well as the team itself. And there may be differences, excuse me. There may be differences around the way people perceive time. And I know from coaching many people who have moved to the Pacific Islands that that can be a frustration. And that's something you have to learn to work with. And I know from coaching people who've moved here with different time dimensions that that's something they need to work with in terms of how others will perceive them if they aren't maintaining the time perspectives that are valued in the local culture. So that can be something that from a team perspective that you need to learn about, to think about, and perhaps not leap into making judgments in those first early days. And in terms of your future plans for the team, have a think about, as Watkins said, who you've got that could be developed and who you've got in terms of skilling up perhaps for future localization. And yet perhaps that's something that you also need to check in with your boss and possibly check in back with head office. Is this a role that people are wanting to localize, or is this something that they hope to keep as a head office position? So in all of the team aspects, there are things that will come in from a cultural aspect that will overlay all the decisions that you're making. So don't forget to take those into account when you're building your team. I had a Japanese CEO come into Australia who communicated how much he appreciated the direct culture. As he said, I can ask people what they think about a decision and they'll tell me. However, he said, back home I need to take people out and get them drunk, and then we'll have a conversation about what they think about a decision I might have made. On the other hand, it might be that when people come and tell you what they really think, that could be quite threatening if you were not accustomed to it. And I've had managers who have, expected a team to be able to open up and share ideas, and in team meetings have sort of met with a stony silence, which wasn't necessarily being negative. It may have been a respectful silence, but it felt like it was negative to the managers who were in that situation. So build your team, but do it with a recognition that culture is at play, and there may be many things you will need to do to change your management style and to change your communication style, to change your mentoring and coaching styles so that they work well where you are. And one of the comments from the survey that I put out to the people that I was in touch with, getting to know, selecting and mentoring the right local staff was key in influencing both other local staff and the customers. So really important thing to take some time to observe the team and to see who might be able to have those influencing abilities. So a moment to think. From what you know about the team already, from what you know about your own value systems, what might be some of the things that you might need to take into account? So just take a note of those. And another comment from the survey: get to know your own needs and then get to know the needs of key local people and help them achieve their goals. So that getting to know your own needs is a really powerful thing as well. So being clear on what you want within the team and the skills that will enable you to perform well. So we're at the last one, and this is keeping your balance. Interestingly, when Watkins, in Watkins's book, he begins with an example each time. And the example he gave for keeping your balance was actually an international example, albeit still within North America, but somebody moving from the USA to Canada, and the challenges that that person encountered in terms of moving well meant that they, in the end, didn't stay in the position, that they returned home. So keeping your balance is a really important aspect. Transitions come with risks. They come with exciting opportunities, but they come with challenges. And just looking at the news this morning at the Save the Children in Kabul and thinking about the fact that there were probably some people from other countries there in that situation as well, or the country manager is probably really in a very difficult situation right now, dealing with the deaths of some of those perhaps local employees. So transitions bring enormous risks at times, and we need to acknowledge them. And we need to acknowledge, as we talk about in terms of stress management, it's not always the size of the wave, though. It's learning how to surf well. So yes, there are risks, but there are things you can do to face those risks with a bit more strength and equanimity than you can otherwise. So what are some of those things you can do? Firstly, get a support network. Get that support network both within the country and within the country made up of both expats and locals. Don't just build your support network within the expat network. It might feel as though they get you or they understand you, but you actually need support from the locals to really understand what's going on around you. And it might be them who will be the ones that will enable you to face the risks more safely, if you like. So that support network within the country is important, but you also need a support network back home to keep you connected and to keep you perhaps, I guess, grounded in who you are as well. So keep those support networks nurtured, make time for them, have chats that are open and honest, and ensure that you schedule that into all the many things that you need to do. And speaking of scheduling, you need to be careful to give yourself time to sleep, to exercise, and to take time out. I spoke briefly before about some of the neuroscience, and we have previously done a whole webinar on the neuroscience of relocation. The thing about all this learning is that it's exhausting on your brain. And the way to help your brain embed the learning is to give yourself sleep time, give yourself time to exercise, and to give yourself relaxing time when actually you can shut down that prefrontal cortex and just coast. Just let your brain, shut your eyes, listen to music, enjoy the scenery, whatever it might be that you do for time out, that you do it. So don't ignore those critical aspects to keeping your balance. Take the time to plan. So take the time to plan and to build in routines and plans, because they are the things that will enable you to actually set yourself up for success. So taking the time to actually plan will be really powerful. I know many of the people that I spoke to said they didn't have a plan. It was off the cuff. We might have talked about the need for a plan, but it wasn't something they'd stopped and done, and they regretted it. So taking the time to really think through what you're doing and why you're doing it. And that said, one of the phrases that I use in coaching is get onto the balcony. So get off the dance floor and onto the balcony. Or if you're perhaps a more sporty person rather than a dancing person, the analogy, get off the playing field and into the grandstand, where you can look down and perhaps see the bigger picture. So take some time to reflect from that big picture perspective. And the last point, which is actually probably the most critical point, is to get home sorted. And by that, I mean take into account your family and their needs. It's a bit radical, but it is critical. The family are the most important component in a person who is relocating with a family. So unless you are a single person, and even then you need to take into account your relationships with core family members back home. But if you're relocating and you have a family, you need to take time and invest that time into getting them sorted. And that might mean finding the right place to live. It might mean finding the right schools. It might mean finding work for your partner or finding significant things that your partner can become involved in. It might mean taking some time out to really talk with everybody about how things are going to work. I know for some of the people that I've worked with in Papua New Guinea, they have the working partner has gone up earlier than the rest of the family and organised the home and helped perhaps get some aspects sorted, and also to get their own work sorted so that when the family do come, that they can focus a bit more on the family. So there's numerous strategies that can come into play there. And in the CI Collective, we have a lot of e-resources about children's needs, about partners' needs. So those things aren't to be discounted. They are critical. The most common reason for early returns from an overseas assignment are family dissatisfaction. So you need to get home sorted. And we all know that we are better workers, more focused when our family are happy and when we feel supported and loved by those that we support and love. So keep your balance. It can be a challenge. And journaling can help. So what you may know that with my co-author Rachel Yates, I have produced a guided journal for adapting to life overseas. So any of you on the call now, I can send you a copy of that journal, and in the follow-up email, I'll be asking you for an address if you would like that journal. So that's just a free gift as part of being on this webinar. So some final thoughts from the expats who contributed to the survey. Be patient, go with the flow. A number of people said give yourself time. Allow yourself time, don't be hard on yourself, don't have unrealistic expectations. And a really long one here, but an important one. Be prepared to admit that your first approach at completing a task is wrong. Don't assume that things, so for example, government departments, I know other people mentioned the banking system or the internet, will work as well as they do at home. Be prepared for additional stress, but also take the time out to recognize the benefits of working under new and challenging circumstances. And recognizing the benefits is a really important part of what we talk about in our cultural briefings. Recognizing the benefits enables people to ramp up their CQ drive because that's where your motivation comes from. Why did you say yes to this assignment? Why do you want to be working there? So acknowledge those benefits. What is it that's driving you to actually go through the challenges? And most importantly, speak to other expats in similar positions. They'll be having the same frustrations. They'll want to ask you the same questions. And although you may not have the solutions, it's good to know that you're not the only one in the position of uncertainty. So we'll jump over this question point so that we do finish within the 45 minutes. But I will be sending out a reflection sheet so that you can spend time reflecting and thinking about all the aspects that we have discussed here. And I want to say thank you. It's been great to have you with us. We will be enabling you to think further with the review handout. And if you would like to receive a copy of Finding Home Abroad, I'm happy to post that out to you. So just let me know in response to that follow-up email. The recording will be made available in the blog for a limited time, and it will be in the membership site permanently. So we'll keep in touch with you and let you know when the blog is posted if you want to listen to the recording, and we'll let you know about future webinars as well. So thank you so much.